Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today's a schmooze day, which means that we don't know what we're going to talk about until we get together and find out what's on people's minds. And so I'm very happy to say that I have three friends with me here who I think don't know each other at all. I doubt that any of them have met each other. So we're really going to have an interesting time getting acquainted and finding out what's on people's minds. So here in Toronto with me, I want to start with Barry Stevens because I think you're here in Toronto. Are you, Barry?
Yes.
Okay, good to see you. I believe Ottawa, we have, I should say that Barry Stevens is a filmmaker, and he's made a lot of films about war, and he's also made a very interesting, more than one film, I guess, about your, what's the title for the category of thing that you discuss with the fact that you're part of the biggest family in the world?
Oh, right. Yeah, that it's they were mostly personal films, but they had a kind of a public purpose as well.
I thought it was very of great interest publicly.
I mean, the most recent film I made about that, which is called The World's Biggest Family, was an examination of the ethics and practice of reproductive technology, particularly sperm donation. Or really, of course, it's a misnomer. It's really the selling of sperm, and the consequences of people having, as in my case, 500 or 1,000 children from one man. Oh. So, that I have 500 or 1,000 half siblings.
Yeah.
You did this on purpose, or it just happened?
I didn't do anything. I was just.
I understand. I do understand.
Right. But he made a film about it, which is really an interesting thing. And I suppose of great interest to people who are interested in genetics and looking at ways in which you can see similarities that are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
You're a wonderful case study. I don't know whether you've.
Well, we are, in fact, the subject. And since a number of my half siblings are, in fact, work in the field of genetics. Mm-hmm. It kind of works, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I just was looking for a one-word description of this social issue, and I couldn't think of one. Maybe there is one that you know of. Anyway, hello, Barry. So now in Ottawa, I think you are, is Zachary Jacobson. And Zach is a retired mathematician. I think you worked last with Health Canada, but you made kind of many parts. Do you want to describe yourself at all?
Well, mainly I'm, and this is my wife.
Hello.
Hi.
Greetings.
That's my wife. I'm married. We should close the door here and have a dog, which you just saw exiting. I'm working on most intensely on we used to call it climate change. We're now calling it incipient global catastrophe. I'm here. I've been putting off. I've always talked about that with you, but we've always joked, and I've said I was never going to mention it. No, it's high time I said it. I'm here to talk about nuclear power. You're going to need it, Meta. You're going to need it if you're going to save humanity just over the next 50 years. Sorry, there it is.
If that's all you want to talk about, okay, we'll see what other people want to talk about.
Well, that's what I was going to bring it up today anyway.
I know you were hoping that Doug Saunders would be here, and I think you would be good allies, but he's not here, and he's not going to be here today, it looks like. So there we go. Now, let's move out toward Winnipeg, where they're having a blizzard, apparently. And Ellen Judd looks very comfortable in her warm apartment or home. Hi, Ellen.
Hello.
Good to see you. And you are a retired sociology professor or anthropology, is that right?
Yes.
Anthropologist, University of Manitoba, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And you specialize in China. You know a lot about especially rural China, right?
That's right. So when we've chatted before, we've talked about China, and I'd be happy to do so again. One of the things that crosses my mind, though, if we're going to touch more topics today, would be to have a little bit of a discussion about January 29th, which is the day of remembrance for the Quebec City Mosque shootings and of action against Islamophobia. And it comes to mind, especially for me right now. Nigan Sinclair drew attention to the idea that he thinks that the other events that we've had in the past few days may have been timed especially to pull the rug out from under the Day of Remembrance. January 29th, Day of Remembrance.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Regarding
several words, but that was the issue.
Regarding the Quebec City mosque shootings and action against Islamophobia. Got rather a little bit overwhelmed this year, so the agenda to think
you
about.
mentioned that because I don't think I was aware of it, frankly. So that shows, it's not caught on as much as it should. So it was a year ago, was it, that there was a shooting at a mosque in Montreal?
It was 5 years ago, and there were 6 men killed.
Barry, your turn.
Probably the most salient thing for me lately in global affairs has been the irrational rush towards a global thermonuclear war, and since that's always been a topic of conversation my whole life, and with you, Meta, in particular. But I've been quite scared by I'm not so scared now, because I think the theatricality of the situation is becoming more apparent day by day. So certainly I'm very interested in that. But I'm glad to hear that Ellen is an expert on China, and because I'm fascinated by the country and having worked there a little bit. And I'm also a big proponent of nuclear power, so power generation.
Well, if we were looking for convergence of interests, and we wanted, because there are several things that could be spoken about China with regard either, let's say, to Islamic matters, you would look at the position of the Uyghurs and their attitude toward them, or we could talk about nuclear power and nuclear weapons in China.
Climate change is an issue that sort of gets you into if you're a climate activist, it gets you into kind of a push me, pull you, because on the one hand, China is doing a real genocide on the Uyghurs, and that's unbelievably awful. And that is actually Islamophobic, among other things. But of all the huge powers in the world, they're the one that's actually heading in what I would call a good direction in the matter of global warming and climate change.
Ellen, you've already got your hands full now. You've got to straighten us all out, setting us right about your position on China's treatment of the Uyghurs and its position on climate change and nuclear power, and maybe also nuclear weapons. In fact, not only maybe, but certainly nuclear weapons, because that seems to be Barry's main concern. So, do you see things the way he did?
It's hard to tell from those short comments, and there's so much everybody is so generously put on the table in terms of talking about China. These are huge issues. China has been developing nuclear power as one of its alternatives to global warming. And that, of course, is quite contentious. There are people who will think that that's a solution to power generation, and those who are very worried about it. But it is true that China is working fairly hard on this. It's pushed to do so because, as a matter of geology, it has enormous reserves of coal, and also that it's been relying upon for a long time, and that it knows it has to stop relying upon. So it's working very hard at various kinds of green technology. So I think that it's attempting to move in a positive direction, but it has a steeper hill to climb than many of us do, that may be able to rely upon hydroelectric or wind or solar in various ways in a somewhat easier way. So I think that
one of the hills it does not have to climb is, it has to climb against the problem that it's already using a great deal of coal. But the hill it does not have to climb is it's got a form of government that can impose its will, which we can certainly not do on big coal producers and oil producers.
Well, we choose not to.
Boy, do we ever choose not to. No.
Okay, here I'm butting.
It can, although there's a sense in which China, the Chinese government and the party has to pay attention to public pressure as well. It's not unaware of that. The mechanisms by which that works are somewhat different, but you can see, for example, in the events of this winter, that it was trying very hard to pursue a green policy. But trying to close down and reduce production to the level that they did was producing such hardship that they then had to loosen the green standards a little bit.
I wasn't watching that. That's interesting.
Because of the pressure they are under. So there are more pressures than I think people are sometimes fully aware.
Right.
So there's a degree of responsiveness, but it certainly does have a capacity to mobilize people in ways that are perhaps more difficult here. So I think that it does have a no first use policy, and there's some peculiar discussions in the press on the subject of worrying about China, this nuclear threat. And it would certainly be much better if China were not also a nuclear power. I'm fully in favor of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. On the other hand, it is so far behind the countries that are leading the modernization of nuclear weapons, such as the United States, that I think it's something of a distraction to look at what China is doing. It would be backing off if it felt it could back off without risking being attacked. So it's basically, I would like all of the nuclear powers to be pulling back from this, but it's not as if the United States is responding to a threat from China, because China is not capable of threatening the United States militarily. So, that is simply not something that we should be deluded into thinking about. So the pressures need to be applied somewhere else, including to NATO and in our own country, to get out of that and to support the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Well, I would agree with you certainly on the desirability of promoting the TPNW, but the question about China's future technological aspirations, I think, is much more of an open question. I had an interview with a guy named Matt Korda, who lives here in Toronto, and he works for the works for the Union of Concerned Scientists or Federation of American Scientists. I get them mixed up, even though they're entirely different organizations. But he works, he was put to work looking at aerial or satellite photos of China. And he's the guy who discovered hundreds of ICBM silos being built in China and in one place. And then a few weeks later, somebody found another place hundreds of miles away when they were putting in another several hundred ICBM silos. Now, they do not have signs on them saying this is an ICBM silo. So I suppose one can contest that that's what they are. In fact, some people say, well, I heard one guy say, where's the dirt? They dug a lot of holes, but and when you take dirt out of a hole, it's got to go someplace, and they can't see where the dirt's been piled up. So what does that matter? I mean, I'm not sure what that means in terms of what these things are for. So if the government of China doesn't tell us what they're for or invite anybody to come in and have a look, I suppose it's questionable what these things are. But the interpretation that was placed on it by, I think, the US government was that these are missile silos. And if that's the case, that is pretty ominous. Hundreds of the things.
If that's true that they're building, I've read that too, ICBM silos. First of all, I don't trust whatever the United States would say about China at all. But if there's an independent analysis that says that, that's interesting. But it would be a foolish thing to do, it would seem to me. And the Chinese are anything but foolish, Chinese government, because an ICBM fixed silo is a target and it just destabilizes, as you know. The US ICBM fields are simply a pointless invitation to strike because of the launch on warning problem. But if perhaps they are doing that, but at the present, it's I agree totally that the treaty to ban nuclear weapons is necessary. But of course, when you say that all the nuclear powers should give them up, there's sort of two classes of nuclear powers. There's countries like China, which have about the same number of nukes as Britain or France, and little players like North Korea and Israel, and then there's the United States and Russia that have between them, I think, 92% of all nukes. So that's kind of an interesting, when you say, well, China's a rising nuclear power, as they do say in the US press a lot. It isn't given that context.
Well, all you need is one, frankly. If you know you've got a good one that nobody knows where it is, I think that's enough to intimidate everybody on the other side, frankly. We don't mess around with countries that have nuclear weapons.
That's true.
I mean, they really are very good for intimidating other countries.
I know, like if everyone wanted to give up nuclear weapons, the only countries that I think, in a sense, could justify having them would be North Korea and Israel, because they really could get wiped off the map, and they are in threat from their neighbors. Really do threaten them. So that's I'm not advocating they should have them, but you can kind of see why they don't want to give them up.
Yeah. Okay.
I just to return to the
I can't. Forgive me, but after all of the analyses I saw, I can't imagine a middle or even lower rank nuclear power ever giving up its nuclear weapons, period. And that's unfortunate.
Well, Canada has, and Ukraine did, and Kazakhstan did, and South Africa stopped its program. So there's some
Libya.
Sorry?
Libya.
Libya, yeah, stopped its program.
We keep interrupting Ellen, who's patient and tolerant, but I think you should have the floor.
I see your eyes rolling.
Well, just very, very briefly in terms of the silos, I think some of the suggestions, they may well be building them, in which case, the question is, where are they actually going to put the missiles? Is it going to be in this silo or another silo? So they might just be moving them around. But I'm not alarmed, but basically I wouldn't be alarmed anyway, because China has so few weapons and such a limited capacity to use them that against the United States, who's presently the only country likely to attack them. And they have been worried in the past about the Soviet Union. I don't think they're worried about Russia right now, but they have been. Basically, China's strategy on this is to have enough weapons it's basically deterrence. They want to suggest that if they were attacked, they would have some weapons left to cause some damage somewhere, maybe just Guam. But they don't have a first strike capacity, and they don't intend to do it. And probably one of the reasons North Korea has its weapons is that it knows it's not going to be protected by China. So China is, in a sense, trying to stay out of this, but to be a tough enough nut to crack that it's not going to get intimidated by either of the two great nuclear powers. So I think that while we would not wish China or anybody else to have nuclear weapons, I think the only real way in which we can reduce the nuclear threat is to work on the the two major nuclear powers. And probably the one we can work on is the United States, which also is the predominant one that's leading the modernization of nuclear weapons. So we have to, in a sense, work where we can work, which would also be on trying to break down this wall of getting all of the United States allies and NATO to have nothing to do with the movement to ban nuclear weapons. So,
and there's our country has not obviously, has just fallen into lockstep as it usually does with the United States. And I think that the Netherlands abstained. I think that was the only NATO country that didn't vote against the treaty.
Mm-hmm.
There was some movement with the Netherlands. I think there'd been a vote that required the government not to go entirely along with NATO, but then it fell into line to some degree when that particular constraint expired or something of that sort. We would have to look that up a bit.
Yeah,
but there has been some movement in Netherlands, and it looks like Sweden's moving, bringing some people together to have discussions of an interested sort around the NPT.
Yeah, at the same time that it's been floated that Sweden should join NATO.
Yes, that is on the cards or on the table, but I'm not. Germany has a new government, and I think it's Social Democrat who's sort of in charge of things with a coalition or something. But I don't understand much about Germany. I wish Doug Saunders were here because he's just been in Germany for 6 months or so and is very aware of what's going on there. But what are the odds? Does anybody know of a change in direction of the German policy on these matters?
It's interesting. I don't know, but it is interesting that of all the countries that are lining up to confront the evil Russians, Germany's been the most complicated and reluctant to move on that.
Well, they are kind of vitally dependent on Russian gas, which brings back, that's because they closed down all of their nuclear plants.
Because they closed their nukes.
And so they became, so Russia's got a gun at their heads,
Yeah, that was incredibly stupid. But by the way, Meta, just to say that when I raised the matter of Ukraine, and in fact it applies to China too. Yes, nuclear war, general nuclear war, is the nightmare, one of the two nightmares of our planet, and certainly I thought for a while that was a danger. But what is actually common to both China and the Russian situation is a real psychology, which we've seen so many times before, expressed in public policy and the media, that just is demonizing the other side and just moving inexorably towards a military confrontation. And it just seems so surprising to me that there's so little. It's like the generation that came out of the Second World War was far more aware of that danger than it seems to me people are now, and it remembering the 80s, as we all do, and those years of the Second Cold War, it seems to me that we're in that sort of mentality again with both China and Russia.
Ellen is always also concerned, I think, about the demonization of China, and I, on the other hand, have a genuine and abiding preoccupation with human rights. And that was always the issue where I would fight with my leftist peacenik friends during the Cold War, where I was so concerned about the importance of Russian or Soviet neglect or abuse of human rights, that I saw that as part and parcel of the whole debate, and that I didn't see how one could just overlook that and say, well, you're demonizing the Soviet Union. Well, It's calling a demon by its real name, in my opinion. Anyway, I don't want to be the person opinionating all throughout this session. So I think it's really Ellen's call. Are we demonizing China?
Certainly that is happening. And I think that this is a useful discussion because it opens up one of the really challenging things that we need to be doing now, which is to be opening up a space where we talk really importantly about peace and justice without being trapped within this new Cold War discourse. So that there certainly are people, though we don't hear them in the mainstream media as much as one would like, who are very concerned about looking at things clearly in a less ideologized fashion, in which one can ask challenging questions about the direction China, for example, is taking, and to look at the impact of global capitalism on China, for example, and look at questions of economic justice and how that flows through in terms of all of the people in these, the hundreds of millions of people producing cheap goods for us, and having this rolled into the state formation that we have currently in China. So that there are ways of looking at peace and justice issues that raise challenging questions for China, but without, in any sense, getting into this Cold War discourse. It's really quite amazing. Like this week, and I'm sure in the coming weeks, we're going to be hearing a great deal about the United States raising human rights issues about China and about the Uyghurs. And this is the country that just devastated Afghanistan and then said, well, it's not in our strategic interest to do things, and is denying to send humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. And then you look at Iraq and Iran and Syria and Yemen, and, it just goes on. So basically,
South America.
Right. We have a discourse here that has weaponized human rights in a way that makes it harder for people to talk about human rights, although people in the China field do talk about it. People who know China well and care about China are, in fact, attempting to deal with this, but it's so difficult to deal with it when it's being used to try to prepare the ground for military engagement with China and for economic warfare as well. So it's difficult, but we can try to open up this space in which we care deeply about peace and justice, but do not allow ourselves to be pulled into a new Cold War by virtue of that discourse. And it is overwhelmingly the case that what we hear is the American version of things. And China hasn't been very good at its messaging to the rest of the world. So that, just to some extent, it's a challenge for people to recognize that China isn't particularly a threat to the rest of the world, but the intensity with which the great powers, China, the US, and Russia as well, are engaged in this global game, the great game again, is very dangerous for all of us.
It's particularly
I wish
difficult.
you would talk more, frankly.
I think it's difficult for Canada in particular, actually, because we're the country that carries the coat of the schoolyard bully kind of thing, and while he beats somebody up, and so we, the whole two Michaels problem and Huawei, we get swiped with that. It's in a sense, threading that needle is very tough. It's very tough because one does want to complain. By the way, interested to hear what you would say on. I have a real problem with the word genocide. It has become such a problematic word that it almost should be dropped. When I made a film about the International Criminal Court, and I remember the passion with which the prosecutor of that court wanted to apply the word to Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, and did in fact get his way. But it had that power, because you say genocide, then, oh my God, you think of the Holocaust and you think of everything. But it's become, that's a word which gets weaponized in the human rights debate. And I'm not, the phrase cultural genocide is the way people get around it. But I think that it should be possible to talk about the Uyghurs and Xinjiang without turning the discourse up to 11.
What would you like to call
I don't know if you know the movie Spinal Tap, but that's a reference to.
No, I don't know that movie.
I didn't. I've never watched it. I should go back. But
It's just a phrase. It's just like you can turn something up to 10. And
okay.
They had. Yeah.
I got the reference.
Yeah.
But well, okay, what would you call it? What the Chinese are doing with the Uyghurs?
Sorry, I couldn't quite.
Well, I think that
Please repeat what you said.
you're trying to deal with something very complicated very briefly, and I'm not a Xinjiang specialist, but I do look at the literature. There appears to be a very strong case for forced assimilation, which is very forced and very assimilationist. And there's every reason to be drawing attention to that.
Absolutely.
And wanting that to be different.
Absolutely.
Whether the use of the word genocide, I think, is complex. When some people are using it, they're trying to evoke the Holocaust or Rwanda, and there isn't any reason to think, there's no evidence that China is attempting to physically destroy the Uyghurs or any of the other minority nationalities. They're wanting to forcibly assimilate them. And nobody would want to have that done. So that is an issue. So the other reason for being willing to entertain the term genocide to some degree is my understanding of the history of it, although there may be people on this call who understand it better, is that the countries of the world were willing to agree that after World War II, that they didn't want something, the genocide of the Holocaust, to happen again. But so we were able to arrive at a convention on genocide. But we haven't got such really good tools to constrain what governments do to their civilian populations beyond that. So to some extent, what we have available in the international realm is an effort to expand the tools on genocide to include more things that are done by states to their civilian populations. And that's why Indigenous people of Canada use the term genocide as well. And so it's hard to oppose expanding the concept of genocide to give additional protections to civilians. But the use of it in the Western world, where we're so horrified by the Holocaust in Rwanda and very reasonably want to protect civilians, is somewhat misleading when it comes to Xinjiang. So it's there is something to be concerned. There is something very legitimately to be concerned about. But as far as I can make out from the searches I've done, the United States hasn't taken a single Uyghur refugee. It's not as if it's doing anything for the people of Xinjiang. It just wants to ramp up the Cold War. So we are again in that really difficult position of trying to defend peace and justice and prevent war.
What? I'm sorry. Okay, maybe this is not an intermediate term that I'm about to use. If you were a Uyghur in one of these camps, would you feel you were, okay, not in a genocide, would you feel you were in a Holocaust?
A Holocaust, meaning like the Greek term?
Yeah, that one.
Meaning you burn everything. But
what I'm just trying to suggest, that what I'm reading coming out from people like Bob Ray and perfectly reasonable people suggests that what's being done to the Uyghurs, you're right, it's forced assimilation. I understand that. But first of all, why? And secondly, is the cruelty not equal? I am given to understand that at least some of the things that are being accused are true. I'm not even going to mention them.
Sure. It's a bad thing. There's no question about it. But one of the problems,
Capital B, capital T, yeah.
It was perhaps wrong of me to raise the issue of the question of the word genocide, and because
no, I'm the one.
Maybe it's
I'm guilty. I'm the one who used it first.
Well, no. I mean, I challenged it, so maybe that was wrong of me. But just to say that the original concept, you remember Raphael Lemkin, who was the guy who came up with both the word and the law, and in its various instances, the language has always been very, very loose. It's always been a crime of intent, and it's always had the phrases like "in whole or in part," and the kind of destruction can be, to cause the mental. I can't remember the exact phrase, but there's so many sort of loopholes in it because, of course, when Lemkin and others framed it in the late 40s, mid 40s, they were thinking, well, there's no point in waiting till it's already happened to lay a charge. So you don't want to see, the entire jury wiped out and then say, oh, that was a crime. So that was part of their reasoning. But the hole they've left is so large that and then when you add the word cultural, it becomes, I thought, kind of meaningless and weakens the whole term. But that's clearly what's being done in Xinjiang. It violates any sense we have of how the collective should respond to a minority.
I think I share your feelings about the word cultural genocide, which I don't think they blur them together. I think people often refer to cultural genocide when they're really just talking about assimilation or people borrowing other people's costumes or calling their football team by the name of
Cleveland Indians,
group.
The Edmonton Eskimos.
Yeah, or use the word Eskimo when you say Inuit or something, and that's cultural genocide. I mean, it gets really overused and it becomes meaningless, and I think I really don't like the term, and I would just abolish the whole term of cultural genocide. But for sure, real genocide is another matter, and where the boundaries are. And whether or not what's going on in Xinjiang deserves the title or not, I think it's an interesting and valid question that it should be possible to give an answer to. You should actually be able to count, camps and bodies and how many women are not allowed to have access to their husband's sperm. So therefore, the reproduction of the population is impaired, and whether that's being done deliberately. That's a kind of genocide, isn't it? If you don't let couples get at each other.
It is, I think, even listed in the law. I don't have it in front of me, the law, so I can't remember the exact wording. I can look it up.
Well, I've heard that that's happening, that they're deliberately keeping couples apart so they can't reproduce.
Yeah.
That's one of the more minor things I've heard.
I was looking up the text of the Genocide Convention, which is, the United Nations one. I mean, there are other ones. The killing members of a group, serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life to bring about physical destructions, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So there you go. And there's also complicity in genocide and conspiracy to commit genocide. So there's a lot of room to to
there is room to use this. I think that the problem is that the way it is talked about very largely in the Western media is without that complexity and without talking
Yes.
about what's really going on, so that it then especially when deprived of any real measures to support the Uyghurs or to give them refuge, doesn't really, it is part of this whole process of, I would call it demonization, but I think it's also distraction, because it's, the United States, with all the things that it has been doing to other populations, Muslim or ethnically different or just not American, to point at the United States and then to weaponize, sort of point at China and weaponize it like this has another agenda. So trying to deal with both these things at the same time is incredibly challenging. So if we could have a reasonable discussion about the use of the term genocide, I think you're quite right. We could be using the Convention on Genocide appropriately in China or in many other places in the world.
There was an occasion, can't remember the year, probably 2004, when Colin Powell stood up and said that there was a genocide happening in Darfur. And it was just when the Abu Ghraib horror of the American occupation of Iraq was starting to really turn American public opinion. So it was very much a case of like, look over there.
Yes, exactly. It's distraction is one of the really important functions that's being used by this. Since Meta raised the issue about limiting births, I think that is one of the issues that people are attempting to raise from the Genocide Convention again. Some of this is going on. I think one of the interesting things to look at is that, as far as I can ascertain from the information that we have about this policy as it's being applied to the Uyghurs, it doesn't appear to me to be distinguishable from the one-child policy that was applied to Han people in China since about 1980 through to about 2015. And it's not been unusual in China to apply policies somewhat later to minority nationality peoples and to try to win them over, to soften it to some extent. Throughout most of that policy, minority nationalities could have one more child than the Han were permitted to have. And then the really punitive policies came in when people were well over the one child goal. So to some extent, the policies, I mean, basically, I doubt if there's anyone on this call who would be very happy about living with the one child regime. So there are things that can be said about that, but they don't particularly target Uyghurs or Muslims. It's just a delayed application of this policy. And it's the least popular thing that the Chinese government ever tried. People absolutely did not like it and avoided it as much as possible for very good reasons. So, but one of the interesting things that just might, I'm not sure people in this call are aware of, but it's really very interesting for people interested in peace, is that the one-child policy that China was persuaded to adopt in 1979 has its roots in the Club of Rome concerns about the global population explosion. And the Club of Rome was something that, with its notion about worrying about China's population, reached some of the few scientists in China who were able, in that day when China was sort of excluded from so much international contact, the scientists who were able to connect with the Club of Rome were ballistic missile scientists. And they also had access to the leadership and access to better computer technology than anyone else. They took these Club of Rome ideas and ran projections about China's population growth, and were able to reach the leadership while China's social scientists were saying, no, this is a disaster, don't do it. So basically, what China is being has dealt with and did accept at its highest political level and then implemented, is an idea that didn't arise directly out of Chinese context. And we have, in some sense, the Cold War and everything with it feeding into the kind of distorted decision-making that led to those policies that nobody wanted. Before the one-child policy, what China indigenously had, their policy was to ask a couple to have a combined age of 50, because the norm in China was to child very rapidly after you're married in your early 20s, to only aim for 2 children and to wait 4 years in between. And the population was, these kinds of things delay the population growth noticeably, which rather than focusing on total fertility rate. So basically, there were quite useful in indigenous approaches, and lots of people for ages kept trying to persuade the government to change their policy, and eventually, it has. It was never a forever policy anyway, or the population.
But they did control their population in a way that, when I remember that a few years ago, when India's population exceeded China's, and it never used to be. India has not, of course, done that, but China has. But I wonder also about the effects of wealth and urbanization, both of which are kind of obviously connected. But when people are more urban, they tend to have fewer children for a number of reasons. And also, when a country is wealthier, they have fewer children because you invest in the children partly to keep you alive when you're old. And if a wealthy state is doing that, or if as China has obviously become incredibly wealthy within the last few decades, that I wonder how much those factors have been important in keeping the population lower than it otherwise would be.
Yeah, and certainly there was a time earlier in the one-child policy when demographers and others were spending a lot of time pointing out that there were other factors that were bringing population down, and the previous policy would also have brought population down. And there were, and when the policy was ended, people didn't all rush out to have extra children either. So, all of the factors that you're talking about have played a role in the reduced rate of population growth in China. And some of it is also just the result of a certain peak of women of childbearing age passing, into an older age cohort as well. So some of it is there's all kinds of interesting discussions that could be had. But
can I ask for a little clarification about something, Ellen? I didn't get it. When they had this policy, which sounded to me like, very good policy, try to have only 2 children and space them several years apart. That sounds like good advice, and I wouldn't imagine the population would object very much to that compared to their objection to the one-child policy. Now, tell me when these 2 doctrines were adopted. Presumably, at first they were trying this milder version, and then switched to the more radical, the more draconian policy. Was that what happened? Was there? You're talking about 2 different periods or 2 different phases of policy, or what?
No, they're essentially 2 different periods. The policy I just described was in effect for a number of years in the 1970s. I can't put exact dates on it. I think but the final years of the Cultural Revolution are a bit more difficult to talk about in terms of policy implementation.
That's when it was implemented. Then
it was in the 1970s, and that was what was being advocated for quite a number of years before there was a change to the one-child policy. I don't think it was in effect long enough to necessarily know what all the consequences, how it would play out in the long term. And it was not linked with the level of enforcement that the one-child policy.
I got just a graph here.
Well, there's a screen
remarkable.
share. There's a screen
Okay.
share function at the bottom of your screen. If
Oh,
you
okay.
have
Let
a
me see if I
graph,
can do
show
that.
us. Sure.
Let
Click
me
on
see if I can do that.
Okay.
But it's interesting that what Ellen is saying is totally borne out. Like, look, the plunge from the Great Leap Forward downwards, all the way down to when the one-child policy begins, and then there's a slight rise, and then a gentler slope, which is really kind of remarkable to me.
It is, and to some extent, in the bigger picture, and it shows here with that one particular downturn with the Great Leap Forward. What I was overwhelmingly clear when I was collecting, household records in the field from the 1980s on, is that after 1949, there was suddenly people had parents who were living and they had a lot of siblings. So after 1949, the return to peace and security meant suddenly people's children were living. And that this was then this huge population increase, and then this huge legacy of people of childbearing age. But it's very often the case, demographers talk about a two-stage demographic transition, which is first people notice their children are living, and then they start having fewer children. So to some extent, some of this is people sorting out the changes that they wish to make in their families, and there's a time lag between those two stages of the transition. And to some extent, we can see that, but it did get pushed, and not only by the one-child policy, but by this intermediate phase as well.
The Great Leap Forward, the demographics are just incredible. I've always read about it, what it was like, but that green spike in the death rate combined with a plunging birth rate is extraordinary. I mean, that was like, I can't remember how many people died in the Great Leap Forward. I've heard 30 million. I don't know if it's true.
Nobody was going around counting, so we're not going to get completely accurate figures, but it was a national catastrophe comparable to the things that we see in our contemporary world in countries that are facing both famine and war at the same time.
Now, here's where I'm confused, because I was in touch with people who had been visiting China during that period, and people who, I think they were just the equivalent of tourists, whatever you want to call them. But they said, well, I didn't hear about that. Is it possible that people were not aware that there were so many million people dying of hunger or God knows what during that period? Even people who visited China said, I didn't see anything. I never heard anything about it. And people here weren't talking about it very much. That's my recollection, that it was not known as much as it needed to be. And I'm not sure that I'm correct. Is that your impression, Ellen?
You've got the advantage of recollection of that on me. I wasn't, I'm a little bit younger, so I don't know firsthand that period. My understanding is that the deaths were overwhelmingly in the countryside, so that there wasn't that kind of access. But there were natural disasters and food supply issues that were aggravated by the government misjudging how much food was available and distributing it so widely that then there wasn't food available. So the argument, there was a combination of natural disasters in a terribly poor country that was still a post-conflict society after a century of devastation. And some policy mistakes that the food supply wasn't there. And some of the things that they did during that period that I heard about and directly from people and are also in the records is that they sent a lot of people from the cities back to the countryside where they thought there would be some food. So that took the pressure off the cities to some extent. And so I think that if there were people who were traveling to the cities, they might not have seen it. They probably would have seen some difficulties, but the places where it was catastrophic was in the countryside. And some parts of it because of misreporting under pressure, perhaps, to give good reports to the government of food supply. The countryside was supplying food to the cities. And so the cities weren't as hard hit, and there was a terrible food shortage throughout large parts of the countryside.
And anybody visiting there in Mao's China would have been fairly strictly controlled, wouldn't they? You know,
I don't think there were so many visitors in the period of the Great Leap Forward, and then there were adjustments made. And
we've come to our conclusion. You see, we always find something to talk about, and it takes us a little while to figure out what we're commonly interested in. But I think this was a very important topic, and thank you very much, all of you. And it's good to have put you together. So hope to see you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice to meet you and to talk with you again, Meta.
Yeah, very good to meet you, Ellen and Zach too. So thank you.
Nice to meet you, Barry. Nice to
Hello, Zach.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode 405. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, please look around. We have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. And to find a particular talk show, just enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your own thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please do join in. See you there.